I want to get to the substance of Israel-Gaza, Israel-Lebanon, and Hezbollah. But before I do, one of the things that really irritates me is this kind of lack of historical knowledge. And I don't mean like history from the 1600s and the Enlightenment. I mean like very recent political history. Maybe that's just a natural part of getting older. You know, you complain these young people don't understand what we lived through. Maybe it's part of that. But I do think there's been this kind of accelerated attempt to make people forget about history because as soon as Trump appeared, the only relevant metric became, oh, forget about what people like Bill Kristol or Dick Cheney and Nicole Wallace, all those people did. The only metric that matters now is someone single-mindedly devoted to destroying Trump and that's it? Or is someone who doesn't think that that's where all political salvation lies? And it's just erased all of pre-2016 history, the financial crisis, and especially the mindset of the war on terror. I think, and I could see this at starting with October 7th, we talked about this very early on, that what was likely to happen was this war on terror mentality was going to return, where, in other words, no matter what the U.S. government did after 9/11, no matter what it did, no strategic goal, no overall benefit to the United States, in fact, often a lot of harms. As long as you were saying you were killing terrorists, it kind of satiated the quest for vengeance. It made people think, okay, well, if it's being done to terrorists, I'm fine with it, even though that label was applied to so many people with no basis whatsoever, totally arbitrary. We know a lot of people were killed and detained in Guantanamo and et cetera, who were completely innocent, had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist group. I think what we're seeing now in Israel is pretty much exactly the same thing, that after October 7th, it became very apparent, not just in Israel, but the United States, that there was going to be this sort of mentality that said anything goes. As long as you're claiming that you're targeting and trying to kill terrorists, no matter how many civilians you kill, no matter how immoral or criminal your actions are, it becomes justified. It reminds me a lot of those years after 9/11. Can you, having not just lived through it, but like been deeply involved in reporting on it, as you said, you are an expert in that region that was targeted primarily, you're an Arabic speaker, talk about the sort of climate that did prevail when it came to trying to successfully inducing Americans to support a whole range of things that they would never have otherwise supported.
You mean after October 7th?
Yeah,
or after
no.
9/11?
Well, after 9/11 and how that might relate to the prevailing mindset now because of October 7th.
Yeah, well, I mean, you saw this. Islamophobia has always been part of American culture. I mean, we've always kind of demonized Muslims as barbarians. That goes back to Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, this kind of stuff. So that's always been part of the rubric of the American ideology. But of course, it got turbocharged after 9/11. And then you began not only a persecution of Muslims in terms of invasive stops and searches and everything else. You saw the state go after all the Palestinian leadership, Samuel Arian, the Holy Land Foundation, all these kinds of figures, obviously at the behest of Israel, Fahad Hashmi, all these others. And these were all Palestinian or outspoken leaders for Palestine. And you began to descend into this world. You saw figures like Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and others use really just racist rhetoric. These people don't know anything about the Middle East. They don't know anything about Islam. They don't speak Arabic. And that poisoned the discourse, which, of course, has fed the response since October 7th, although I think with this live streamed genocide and the kind of images and now I think what's readily apparent, the lies that Israel tells like they breathe, it's become harder for the Zionist state to sustain this fiction. But yeah, the demonization of Muslims, and in terms of history, somehow it's a race that the 2.3 million Palestinians were living in the world's largest concentration camp, open-air prison, completely under siege for 17 years, being periodically bombed. Remember, the Palestinians in Gaza don't have an air force. They don't have armored units. They don't have a navy. They don't have artillery units. It's not a war. It's just periodic slaughter, what the Israelis would call mowing the lawn. And so they broke out of their concentration camp filled with a very understandable rage, and I'm not defending. There were clearly atrocities that were committed. But to understand is not to condone, but we don't even make the effort to understand. We would not have reacted, frankly, any differently. And now we're on the cusp of a potential war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And this is also a failure on the part of the United States. Look, the genocide in Gaza would be halted tomorrow if we imposed an arms embargo. I think it's 68% roughly of the munitions that Israel uses now comes from the United States. We have the power to do it, but we don't have the political will to do it because AIPAC owns the U.S. Congress. The Congress people couldn't leap to their feet fast enough to cheer somebody who's being investigated as a war criminal, I think is a war criminal, and is carrying out actively in real time a genocide. It's convenient to forget history. It's convenient to forget context, because if there is no context, then when we see an event like October 7th, it's incomprehensible. Without context, it's incomprehensible, and then it's a very short step to making the people who carry out those attacks incomprehensible as human beings.
Yeah, I think this issue, probably more than anything else, does illustrate the power of independent media when it's free, which is, as you all know, and you just recounted in the very first question, 20 years ago, the corporate media had a monopoly on what we knew about what the Israelis were doing in West Bank and what they were doing in Gaza. And now everybody, much of the world, including Gazans, who are blockaded for decades and subject to all sorts of deprivation, have telephones and social media accounts, and they can just upload firsthand what it is that they're actually seeing and what it is that's actually happening. And it's kind of taken away the power of the corporate media, which hasn't even been able to get into Gaza except with the very strict controls of Israel anyway. And I think you clearly see the changes in at least the younger generation who hasn't been fully indoctrinated yet about what Israel is and how they're supposed to think about it. Let me just shift gears a little bit, because in the time we have left, I definitely want to ask you about the war in Ukraine, which is now about to conclude its second full year. Actually, its third full year, which will be in February of 2025, just a few months, and then into its fourth year. Before we get to the U.S. policy part of it, or just the kind of strategic issues that the West has embarked on, what do you make of the war itself? I've had all kinds of foreign policy experts on, mostly ones who used to be on mainstream media shows who are now excluded because of it, who have been saying all along, it may take a while, it may take some Russian losses, but there's no possibility that the Ukrainians can win in the sense that the West has defined victory, namely expelling all Russian troops from every inch of Ukrainian soil, including Crimea, in so many reasons, if nothing just else, because of the difference in population and the availability of soldiers to keep fighting on front lines. And we're now sort of seeing that. Where do you think this war is going, given that the West did define victory in a maximalist way, almost in a way that would the Russians would rather use nuclear weapons than accept, certainly when it came to Crimea. How is the West going to get out of this box that it's painted itself in, where they either achieve impossible goals or suffer, by their own definition, a loss and a humiliation?
So the West goals they always understood, the military, U.S. military and European military, always understood that Russia would win a war of attrition. That was never in doubt. The goals were very different from the goals that are embraced by Ukrainian nationalists. This is a proxy war. I covered proxy wars all over the globe. The aims of this proxy war were to degrade the Russian military and isolate Putin, especially from Europe. And that has largely succeeded. Its proxy wars are very cynical. They will use the aspirations of a nationalist or an insurgent movement to further their own interest. I used to cover the Kurds, which would be useful for a time in putting pressure on Saddam Hussein. And then this was Kissinger. They pulled the plug, and next thing you know, the Kurds were massacred in Anfal, 180,000 Kurds, and their villages dynamited and everything else. So this is a proxy war. And it was always understood. I mean, I've been around. I was in the last tank battle of the first Gulf War. M1 Abrams tanks are extremely temperamental, very difficult to navigate and control and maneuver. and it takes a very long time to know how to use them. They're throwing these sophisticated equipment at the Ukrainians, and they know full well that they're not capable of actually using it, or that it won't make a difference, a significant difference. So that's the goal. Those were the two goals. Those two goals have largely been achieved. We will end with a negotiated settlement, which we could have had before the war began. Even the repugnant Henry Kissinger initially made this point. There will be an exchange for land for peace. But the goals of the United States and of those who have provided the weapons and backing for this proxy war will be achieved. And of course, tens of thousands of Ukrainian dead, hundreds of thousands maimed, villages destroyed. We did the same thing in Afghanistan. So I think we have to separate the actual goals from the rhetorical goals, which are not the same.
Which is good advice for pretty much every American war. But let me just ask you.
Yeah.
I know like the Western policy planners can very cleverly adopt goals that aren't necessarily in matching with, or sometimes are even the opposite of, the rhetorical package in which it's sold. Like, oh, whether to save democracy and save Ukrainian sovereignty, as though that's the reason we fight wars. But at the same time, these wars do have the potential, especially when you're talking about major nuclear powers on one side and the largest nuclear power in Russia on the other, at least the country with the largest nuclear stockpile, to spin out of control pretty quickly. That's been a concern for a long time. And each time Russia advances and the Ukrainians look further and further away from what the West described as victory, you've seen the US, Germany, NATO as a whole crossing lines that they kept saying they would never previously cross. And it seems like the most dangerous one now is on the table, which is allowing not just NATO to send long-range missiles to Ukraine with the green light to use them to strike deep inside Russia, but it would entail, as President Putin said correctly, some kind of technical assistance by NATO, which would make, by every metric, NATO a direct belligerent in the war in Ukraine against Russia. Not just a proxy war, but an actual war between the two sides. Thankfully, there seems to be at least someone somewhere pushing back on that, crossing that line, because Keir Starmer and the French are desperate to do it. And the U.S. is at least a little resistant. Who knows where that will go? But how do you assess the magnitude or the reality of out of control escalation risk from misperception, miscommunication, poor intentions, or whatever from this war?
Well, that's how massive conflagrations begin. You go back and read Barbara Tuchman's The Proud Tower. Once you open that Pandora's box of war, it controls you. You don't control it, which is why what we're seeing right now between Hezbollah and Israel is so dangerous, especially if it brings in Iran. So, and you're right. If you go back at the beginning of this conflict, there were all these U.S.-imposed red lines in terms of weapons systems that would not be granted. And every one of those red lines was crossed. And now, of course, they're giving potentially Ukraine the ability to strike deep inside Russia itself. And I would go back to 1989. I was there and covered the agreement to create a unified Germany, which we forget had to have the acquiescence of the Soviet government, the then Soviet government under Gorbachev. And the deal was, I was in the room, I saw it. The deal, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, James Baker, our Secretary of State, promised that NATO would not be expand beyond the borders of a unified Germany. That was the deal. That was the promise. It was a promise that was almost immediately broken. Why? I think, one, because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, so there was kind of hubris of a unipolar world, but also because billions of dollars of money were made by Raytheon. I was in Poland a while ago, and there's billboards from Raytheon all over the place. There was billions of dollars to be made by reconfiguring these former Warsaw Pact countries to make their military equipment compatible with NATO. In many ways, Ukraine had already become a de facto NATO country. We had advisors in there. We were giving them equipment. So I would say that there's a good example of, and you had a cable released by WikiLeaks by William Burns, now the head of the CIA, who was the ambassador, who said that across the political spectrum, Ukraine is it's unacceptable for NATO to build or Ukraine to be incorporated into NATO by anybody in Russia. And we forget that historical trauma, both in World War I and World War II, You saw an invasion of Russia. You can go back to the Napoleonic invasion in the early 1800s. It all came through Ukraine. So, yeah, there's, the consequences of this are not, you can't control them. When you keep pushing and pushing and pushing, as we have seen now with these attacks in Lebanon, thousands of people have been wounded. And there was 2 days of attacks. Of course, Hezbollah, Israel has now moved forces up to the border with Lebanon. I think that there's now, apparently, according to the Israeli press, a dispute between the defense minister Gallant and Yoav Gallant and Netanyahu about whether they will invade, although it appears they may invade. They want to create a buffer. I mean, this can just go terribly, terribly, terribly wrong. And I think history has pointed out that once you begin these kinds of tit-for-tat escalations, it's very easy, to whatever the intentions of both sides, to lose control. Because I think if you look closely at what has happened in the Middle East since October 7th, both Hezbollah and Iran have shown incredible restraint because they don't want a war.
Absolutely. And even though we keep hearing that they're an apocalyptic regime who is irresponsible with every weapon, certainly, if anything, they've, from the perspective of people who think Israel is the aggressor, have shown a frustrating level of restraint in terms of retaliating. All right, let me just ask you this last question. And by the way, just on that issue of kind of the importance of history that we were kind of in a curmudgeonly way talking about earlier, on a couple of occasions, we've interviewed Sarah Wagenknecht, who is a very prominent, longtime left-wing politician in Germany who's started to break with the left on a lot of different issues, including Ukraine. One of the very few sort of non-populist right or AFD type figures who has. And one of the things she said the very first time I interviewed her that really put things into perspective for me was she was saying how insane it is that Germany would be sending tanks once again eastward to the Russian border with their Russian leaders screaming in German about the glories of war and the necessity to defeat Mother Russia. Given the history of World War II, imagine how threatening and traumatizing that is, and that's the kind of thing you can only understand from that historical perspective. Just the last question on Lebanon, which you just referenced. One of the things that, from the beginning of October 7th and the Israeli bombardment of Gaza, that I've heard a lot of people on my show talk about, is that there's a danger that Netanyahu and the Netanyahu government might want to open up a new front against Hezbollah. Netanyahu needs war in order to stay in office, to avoid prison. He is surrounded by people who have this fanatical, highly militarized view. If anything is an apocalyptic, religious cult, it's becoming that dominant faction in Israel. And that he may want to war with Hezbollah and drag the United States into it, and then suddenly you have the U.S. and Israel fighting all of Israel's enemies in the Middle East. Do you think this attack that they just carried out, these two attacks now today as well as the yesterday one with the pagers, is designed to kind of provoke a conflict with Hezbollah and then maybe even with Iran, which they link to Hezbollah, in a way that could drag the United States in? How concerning is that to you?
I think it's very likely, because if you look at the pattern in Gaza, they'll negotiate usually through Egypt a kind of tenuous ceasefire with Hamas, and then Israel will provoke, carry out airstrikes, killings, to provoke a response from Hamas. This is the way the ceasefires always break down in Gaza, and then they use that as a pretext to, in their parlance, mow the lawn, to go in there and use industrial weapons to kill large numbers of Palestinians, destroy infrastructure, water purification plants, etc., power plants, all that kind of stuff. So, yes, this fits the pattern. The Israelis have to know that there will be a response. I was just reading a report in the Israeli press that said that they're preparing for potential attacks on Ben Gurion Airport and the port in Haifa. Those are the kinds of targets Hezbollah has not hit in the past. Netanyahu has been trying to get the United States to go to war with Iran for a very, very, very long time, going all the way back to the Bush administration. And I had lunch in that interim before Obama came into power, and with the Iranian ambassador at the UN, and he said, "Don't worry, they won't go to war." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because we have told them that if any attack, even if it's just an Israeli attack on Iran, the green zone will no longer exist, along with all the other U.S. bases in Iraq." So it's not new. Netanyahu's been quite public about it. So yes, he would like to create a conflagration that brings in Iran, and then because of the power of the Israel lobby, you will get congressional approval. I mean, it would be it's nightmarish. I mean, it's just, I don't want to use the word apocalyptic, but it's as somebody who spent 7 years in the Middle East, it's absolutely terrifying. But yes, that's his intention. That has been his intention for a very long time. They know very well that after what they have done over the last 2 days in Lebanon, that there will be a response. That response will not be restrained. And I would argue that the Hezbollah response, although it's true, 80,000 to 100,000 Israelis have had to evacuate the north, Hezbollah's potential to create damage in Israel is far, far greater than anything it has done. But that we may now see. I mean, I think it's more likely than unlikely that we will see a huge upsurge in terms of military activity and probably a cross-border incursion into Lebanon by Israel.
Chris, for reasons I think are very obvious to anyone who just watched us speak for the last hour or so, there are very, very few people, if there are any, from whom I learn more and who I value reading as much as your work, just steeped in firsthand reporting and an in-depth knowledge of the region and a willingness to say what you actually see without any concern or fear. So I know there's been some changes in where you are now, so just update everybody who I hope will do so about where they can follow your work.
It's chrishedges.substack.com, and my show was terminated on the Real News after I kept going after Biden for the genocide and holding Biden accountable for the genocide. So yeah, everything comes out on Substack, and there's also a Chris Hedges YouTube channel that runs the shows. And I just want to say, Glenn, the admiration is mutual. I've long followed your work for many, many, many years, and yeah, you're one of the beacons among us.
Really appreciate it, Chris. I feel obviously the same way. I'm so glad we were able to work out with both of our schedules, getting us together. I very much would love to do so again. I actually had a lot more things that I was hoping to ask you about, but time limits are time limits. So it was great to finally talk to you on our show. I've been on your show before, and we should definitely try and do this more often.
Great. Thanks, Glenn.
Have a great evening. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.